Sure. All right, my name is Martha Kenney. I'm Assistant Professor of Women and Gender Studies at San Francisco State University. And I'd like to first begin with a brief land acknowledgement. The land on which we are gathering for the Feminist School of Art is on the unceded territory of the Ohlone people. It's impossible to talk about land and landscape in the U.S. without considering first that we're meeting on occupied land. As a white settler, I know that the ways that I've been taught to see, represent, and relate to land and to nature participate in the ongoing process of settler colonialism. So today, I want to think about how we can dismantle violent ways of knowing and representing the world that we've inherited. We'll be thinking about the politics of landscape and the politics of nature. So when I think about the politics of nature, I start with these three questions that I learned from feminist theorist Donna Haraway. She asked, what counts as nature, for whom, and at what cost? So just to think about some of the ideologies of nature that many of us have inherited, which are both culturally and historically specific. So we think about nature as an uninhabited wilderness, nature as being outside of history, nature as separate from culture or people, nature as the opposite of the urban, nature as something valuable that must be protected, nature as a place to discover yourself, nature as a place for leisure activities, a place where we can get away from it all, and the national parks especially we think about as sort of quintessentially American. So in this talk, I want to think about nature as a political construction that's central to white nationalism in settler colonial nations such as Canada and the United States. And because nature is understood as natural, representations of nature tend to naturalize social hierarchies and power relations. So landscape painting, which we're going to talk about today, is one genre of representation that perpetuates and justifies the construction of nature as available for the use, pleasure, and profit of white settlers. The landscape paintings teach us particular ways of seeing the natural world that uphold settler claims to land and national identity. So as a non-art historian, thinking about landscape painting, I wanted to kind of get into this genre in more specificity, so I took a little field trip to the De Young. They have a lot of great 19th century American landscape paintings, such as this one. This is called Recreation by Jerome Thompson. This is 1857. And this is just from the little description that is posted beside the painting in the gallery. They write, in the mid-19th century, rapid industrialization, particularly in the Northeast, began to replace the agrarian lifestyle that had historically defined American life. Rural sightseeing, mountain hikes, and pastoral picnics, or images of these activities, provided an idealized encounter with nature for city dwellers seeking a respite from the toil and troubles of city life. So I have a close-up of the figures in this painting. So what do you notice about gender, race, class, sexuality from looking at these figures? Yes?
Well, they all seem to be like fairly wealthy. Like, looks like the clothing they're wearing is dyed very nicely. Like those like purples, a really nice and important color. There's like light purples in there. Then they're all seem to be like almost paired one for one with a male. I see like one person who like doesn't seem to be paired with the other people, but they might actually be like a maid of some sort. And yeah, it seems like it's just a nice evening for some white folks who have not showing any signs of sweat from climbing up to the highest peak in Vermont. It doesn't look like it was hard for them.
And they brought a lot of china up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was particularly interested in the gazes. Women are gazing at men and men are gazing at women. We don't have any men gazing at men or women gazing at women. So we have this kind of white, heterosexual, classed relationship with nature. This is, what counts as nature for whom and at what cost. We're thinking about here, like who has access to this thing called recreation. I think this painting has the perfect name, recreation. And it's important to place this historically, right? This is happening, we've got 1857. So this is right between the Trail of Tears and the Civil War in American history, when this kind of idealized encounter with nature is being staged for particular people and not others. So in his famous essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, William Cronin encourages us to think of nature as a construction that's both ideological and historical. He writes, the removal of Indians to create an uninhabited wilderness, uninhabited as never before in human history, reminds us just how invented, just how constructed the American wilderness really is. It is entirely a creation of the culture that holds it dear, a product of the very history it seeks to deny. So he's getting us to think of this ahistorical, universal idea of nature as very specifically historical and predicated on the removals of indigenous people from the land. Damian Skinner argues that it was not enough to assert legal processes that had transferred ownership from indigenous people to settler populations, or to create and manage processes of dispossession. The land itself had to be reimagined and remade. And in this process, ideologies of race and the organization of space became intertwined. So here we can think of art as one of these places where the land itself is being reimagined and remade for the settler gaze. Jill Cassett argues that 19th century landscape paintings reimagined nature to evoke an emotional investment on the part of European viewers in the land European colonization had alienated from its original inhabitants. So this is a kind of a fantasy space in the life of the nation state where we're creating these romantic and sentimental attachments to the land for people like those who are painted in recreation. So in recreation, we can see how nature is constructed as a space of leisure within a larger project of U.S. nationalism. We see the representation of an innocent, wholesome, unalienated connection to the land for wealthy, white, urban settlers who are super heterosexual. And this is at a time of significant indigenous dispossession. So landscape painting works as this fantasy space in which to manufacture belonging to stolen land and to naturalize specific formations of gender, race, class, and sexuality that's advantageous to the nation state. And we don't need paintings with people in it to see this. This is another one from Lindsay Young. This is Albert Bierstadt, California Springs, 1875, and this is of the Sacramento River Valley. And they write on the little description that accompanies the painting, this lush view of the Sacramento River Valley would have convinced viewers and potential settlers that California was suitable for both habitation and cultivation. So we have no people in this, but we have cows and we have this pastoral land that's ready for farming. There's another one. This is Asher Brown Duran, a river landscape, 1858, and he's part of the Hudson River School. And this is a quote that's on the description from the artist himself. He writes, "I refer you to nature early that you may receive your first impressions of beauty and sublimity unmingled with the superstitions of art. So here we have the artist imagining a painting like this as an unmediated encounter with nature, even though it's highly mediated and highly culturally specific. So we've got European oil painting, and especially influenced by German Romanticism as the style and medium in which the nature is being rendered here. So we can see how these power relations are being hidden by imagining this direct encounter with nature itself. So what counts as nature for whom and at what cost? I'm going to argue that the romantic gaze that sees nature as something valuable that we have a sentimental attachment to, and the extractive gaze, seeing nature as a resource for capital, I'm going to argue that they're not opposite, even though they might at first seem to be, but they're co-produced. We're seeing during this period the construction of land for commerce, agriculture, leisure, and then also wasteland. These landscapes of extraction or sacrifice zones. And I'm taking my thinking around wasteland from Tracy Boyles, who wrote Wastelanding, Legacies of Uranium Mining in Navajo Country. And she writes, remaking native land a settler home involves the exploitation of environmental resources, but it also involves a deeply complex construction of that land as either always already belonging to the settler, his manifest destiny, so the paintings that we looked at are part of that, or as undesirable, unproductive, or unappealing, in short, wasteland. And then later, through wastelanding, the logic of settler colonialism denies that its wastelands could be sacred, could be claimed, could have a history, could be thought of as home. Instead, to wasteland a space is to defend the notion that land is, always has been, and always will be, empty except for Indians. To mark it and make it ultimately as sacrificial land. And so she's talking about uranium mining in Navajo country, where the Dene people live. And so we can think about desert and how desert in that case is being manufactured as a wasteland, as remote, as uninhabited. But we can also think of large projects. This is the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, which is one of the largest industrial sites in the world. And right down the river is Fort Chipewyan, where 90% of the people are indigenous. And they're experiencing reproductive harm and also rare cancers and other kinds of health problems that the Canadian government is trying to cover up. So I'm going to argue that this landscape is the other side of the coin to the landscapes like this. And here's a piece by Erin Marie Consmo, who's a Métis artist and activist. It's called Our Bodies Are Not Terra Nullius. And we might think of this as a kind of a counter landscape. We see a critique of the effects of resource extraction on indigenous bodies. We've got the colonial ship, we have the oil industry, and we have a gesture that makes us think about reproductive justice and how these extractive industries not only cause reproductive harm, but create environments that are wastelands where it's not possible to raise children in safe and healthy environments. And so here we have nothing that we would associate with that romantic 19th century landscape, but it's a landscape nonetheless that that encourages us to think about bodies and land as connected, not as this empty space either for extraction or for leisure, but one of the people live kind of in everyday lives, often in toxic relationships to the land. So these ways of seeing are very, still in the 21st century, really ingrained in how we look at and represent nature. So this is a very famous painting, Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, 1818. And we see in 2018, 200 years later, how how these romantic gazes continue to influence how we think about and represent nature. So this is from an Instagram account called InstaRepeat, which collects nature photographs to show how similar people are representing nature and their own relationship to nature. So this one, for example, is the exact same waterfall. It's the exact same shot. It's got a figure wearing a yellow raincoat, and it's 12 different Instagram accounts. This one with the holding up a fern. We have these women. Medium shot of the back of a blondish person's head with windy hair, part 3. So there's other ones. Then we have this hand holding with the girl. What do we notice about representations of nature like this? What counts as nature for whom and at what cost?
I want to point out the first one that you showed. One of the comments says, but if they're alone, who's taking the photo?
Yeah. It's a good question. All of these ones, these lone figures. And then later, we kind of get a sense of who's taking the photo. We have the your heterosexual partner who you are embarking on this wilderness adventure with. This is the kind of travel Instagram conventions, right? So we have a lot of white, young, able-bodied people who are coded in different ways as heterosexual, who are still participating and in ways that have, some similarities and some differences to those romantic paintings, showing this romantic attachment to nature. I want to take a brief detour to talk about canoeing. So I am originally from Canada, grew up in Toronto, and landscape canoes and Canadian nationalism are something that's deeply intertwined within this kind of Canadian national imaginary. Canada is a country that is always undergoing a identity crisis. Because it's next to such a kind of powerful and loud country, there's this question about what does it mean to be Canadian? What's an authentic Canadian identity? And often landscape is used as, landscape and landscape paintings are used as a way for Canada to explain Canada to itself. And canoeing is one of the kind of main tropes, which is a leisure activity, going all the way back to recreation, that is kind of central to this kind of Canadian nationalism. So you'll see something like this. God first created the canoe and thought up the ideal country to go with it. Thus did Canada come into being. And if we know anything about history, that's not how that happened. Right? And this next quote is from Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is Prime Minister from 1968 to 1984, and he's the father of the current Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Yeah, so this is a very famous quote from the elder Trudeau. What sets canoeing expedition apart is that it purifies you more rapidly and inescapably than any other. Travel 1,000 miles by train, and you are a brute. Pedal 500 on a bicycle, and you remain basically a bourgeois. Paddle 100 in a canoe, and you are already a child of nature. Right? We have the land as birthing a certain kind of Canadian. And Bruce Erickson encourages us to think about these myths around canoeing with the settler colonialism lens that we've been using so far in this talk. So he writes, the myth of the canoe in Canada celebrates an image of landscape as the justification for the establishment of the nation. This discourse argues that prior to its inception, Canada existed in the land itself, and it was up to European subjects, through use of the canoe, an indigenous cultural artifact made into a tool of colonization, to extract nation from the landscape. Indeed, the ideal relationship of landscape held by the canoe is about hiding the actual form of relationship with the landscape, whether racist colonialism or the production of heterosexuality, to accomplish the fetishization of the leisured supposed innocent connection to the land of the New World. So here thus did Canada come into being, right, hides the way that settlers appropriated the canoe and used it as a tool, eventually, of dispossessing indigenous peoples from the land. So canoeing is, like I said, one of these things that Canada uses to explain itself, and the other is landscape painting, specifically the group of seven, who were seven, or there's more than seven of them, but seven landscape painters, early 20th century. These are some just examples of some group of seven paintings.
What was that Instagram site called?
Insta_repeat. Yeah. So the group of seven also are part of the ways that Canada kind of manufactures this kind of nationalism. So this is Scott Watson. He says, as legend had it, and he's being snarky here, and this legend is available as history at any major Canadian art museum. The group of seven created uniquely Canadian art. That they did so using European methods, that is, oil paintings of landscapes, and European models, the modernism of the post-impressionists and Art Nouveau, but specifically Scandinavian landscape painting, is well known, but has not undermined the group's claim to have made authentic Canadian images. So similar to what Cronin was doing with the wilderness, Watson wants us to think about just how artificial something that's made to seem natural is. And so, you know, if you're a Canadian, a young person, you will encounter the group of seven in school. You might, in Toronto, you might make a little pilgrimage to the McMichael Gallery that has a lot of these paintings. So the group of seven set out to define a quintessential wilderness imaginary that could be deployed to galvanize the national psyche. And it worked. I mean, this is, like I said, it's still, this is Canadian art history in its kind of purest form, which is to say its dominant form. And so the most famous person in the group of seven, who is not actually a member of the group of seven, is Tom Thompson. He died before the group of seven was formed. And these are both paintings of Algonquin Park, which is a large provincial park in Ontario. And he died in a canoeing accident on Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park. So has become this kind of martyr of the Canadian wilderness. None of the other group of seven ever painted there again. It was set up as this kind of shrine to Tom Thompson. And so I've grabbed two paintings that have the canoe in them, but also no people, no figures, otherwise empty. And so these, like the landscape, the canoe, the Canadian identity, these are so intertwined that you'll see, for example, this is Frank Geary's extension of the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario. And as you'll see, it looks like the inside of a canoe, right, with the ribs. And it's got that kind of white and wood colors that we can recognize from these Tom Thompson paintings. And Frank Gehry, he lives in LA, but he's from Toronto. So he would have grown up with the group of seven as being these kind of quintessential Canadian painters. So this is me and my friends this is Lake Louise in Banff National Park, which is Canada's first national park, and we were on an art residency. Half of us are artists and half of us are scholars. And you can see some conventions of the tourist wilderness photo, where it was very kind, the thousands of other tourists who are around us move just slightly out of the frame so that it can look like we're here in Banff all alone. And I think another tourist very kindly took a photo for us, and I took a number of these photos for other tourists. But here you can see a sort of kind of manufacturing of Canadian identity, and also making of an attachment to the landscape as like part of our sociality as a group. It's super beautiful, and I had a really nice time. But it's also important to recognize how these kinds of ways of seeing and representing are caught up in these histories of settler colonialism, which is ongoing. And so when I was there, I wanted to canoe on Lake Louise. I'm very good at canoeing, by the way. I can, if I can perform a canoe over canoe rescue, if your canoe gets swamped, which is when it's overturned. And so I grew up with these kinds of ideologies, right? So I was like, okay, maybe I can rent a canoe and paddle around the lake. So I went to the website. It is $115 to rent one of these canoes per hour. And so they use the Trudeau quote here. They say, the late Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, loved canoeing, famously commenting that it makes you a child of nature. Become a child yourself again, or bring the kids along, and paddle along across the world-famous Lake Louise. Life moves in perfect unison with the sights and sounds of the wild as you guide your bright red canoe across our brilliant blue-green waters towards the towering Victoria Glacier. No previous experience required. So with the photo and the blurb here, again, we can see this manufacturing of this kind of leisure connection to nature. We have this white woman at the front of the canoe. We have this kind of heterosexual scene with the man he's sterning, he's steering the canoe. But the photo is focused on the woman. We have this idea of bring the kids along, as if like you have kids necessarily to bring along, and that you can kind of you can initiate them into this relationship with the wilderness for $115 per hour. And a half an hour is $105 per hour, so they're like, kind of try to go for the whole hour. So this is an untenable way of figuring the landscape and the canoe. So I'd like to kind of introduce a counter-representation from scholar and poet Leanne Simpson. She's Anishinaabe. This is a poem from her book, This Accident of Being Lost. I have it on the handout for you. But what she is imagining is stealing a canoe, or stealing back a canoe, from this warehouse of disused crafts. So they've got bruised bodies, dry skin, hurt ribs, dehydrated rage. That's how it's described. And so the canoe is personified, and we're like similar to our bodies are not terra nullius, asking us to think about the canoe, the cultural artifact, and the bodies and indigenous bodies within the same frame. So she steals the canoe, Quay, she steals it from this warehouse of disused canoes, and she brings it to a lake. So I'm just going to read the end here. She pulls her out into the middle of the lake, sinks her with 7 stones, just enough to fill her with lake and suspend her in wet. Quay sings the song, and she sings back. Quay sings the song, and she sings back. We have a reclaiming the canoe as part of an indigenous resurgence for us to think about the canoe and indigenous people within the same frame, and to take it away from this kind of scene of nationalism, which is only available for people who can pay $115 per hour to rent a canoe. So these ways of seeing and making and imagining landscape are so, what do I want to say? They're so sticky. They're so ubiquitous that even when we imagine other planets, we bring these ways of seeing and ways of representing. So in the last part of the talk, I want us to think about Martian landscapes. Often when we talk about other planets, when we talk about space exploration, we are using the tropes of colonialism. So we talk about space as a frontier. We talk about Mars colonies or colonizing Mars. This is a stock photo right here. Right now, as people are thinking about actually going to Mars, we have some very powerful and wealthy people lining up to represent Martian landscapes as habitable in particular ways. So this is SpaceX. So here we see, in all of these, we see CGI is the new oil painting when we're talking about Martian landscape. So this is SpaceX. This is Elon Musk's vision for colonizing Mars. This is called Mars Base Alpha. And so this is one of our visions. We have the United Arab Emirates. They are creating a compound out in the desert called Mars Science City. And the idea is to create a Martian city on Earth so that the United Arab Emirates is able to build a city on Mars in 2117. I especially like the palm trees in this one, which I don't think is probably a good plant to bring with you to Mars. But here we can see a different kind of nationalism, right, associated with the UAE. We think about those artificial palm tree islands shaped like a palm tree. So this is United Arab Emirates. And this is Lockheed Martin. This is their Mars Base Camp lander, or an image of it. And I was reading this article where they were asking the CEO of Lockheed Martin if they were worried that SpaceX was taking away their glory for participating in the human habitation of Mars. And so this is Lockheed Martin CEO Marilyn Hewson. She says, in terms of being the first to Mars, we have been on every Mars mission from the very first one. I think we will continue to be on every mission to Mars. So very, very sure that Lockheed Martin is part of the Mars human future. So here we have tech money, oil money, and war money. And these are the people who are defining how we're imagining the Martian landscape and using these kinds of colonial idioms. And so I want to bring us into, I want to give us a kind of a counter proposal from Anishinaabe and Métis artist and scholar Elizabeth Lapace. A mini comic for you. The printing didn't work out very well, but I'll show you the PDF. It's called They Come for Water. Okay. So it's very, very simple. The story, they come for water. NASA confirms water on Mars that can sustain life. As water on Earth continues to be contaminated. Igniting a mission to claim and colonize. Awaking the ones who eat the eating ones. That's the comment. So we have this kind of this indigenous revenge fantasy that's really closely tied to water politics now on Earth. And I mean, we've had these kinds of critiques of kind of space colonization and extraction in a number of kind of popular media. So you can think about, I don't know, like Avatar or Doom, the video game. But those are more about the kind of settler anxieties of like what is the underbelly of these kind of fantasies of colonization. But Elizabeth LaFonce here, she puts it in the frame of indigenous critique of settler colonialism and getting us to think what a different kind of future might be. This is part of the indigenous futurisms movement. Indigenous peoples are often imagined as belonging to the past, and those who are working with indigenous futurisms are working to imagine robust futures for indigenous people and not only for settler purposes like resource extraction or leisure or these kinds of sentimental attachments that we've been talking about. So back to the PowerPoint. So in the context of the Feminist School of Art, I was wondering if we can think about landscape not only as reinforcing these kinds of dominant power relations and social hierarchies, but to use it as a place where we can imagine different kinds of futures. You know, futures that are different from those who have billions of dollars, or even those who have $115 to rent a canoe. So Jill Cassett, she writes, I propose that landscape be understood not merely as a European genre of painting and gardening or technique for the production of imperial power, but also as a vital but overlooked medium and ground of contention for counter-colonial strategies. So it's this suggestion that I kind of wanted to run with today in the painting part of our workshop. So if landscape painting has been central to settler colonial power, what would it mean to work with and against this genre to create new ways of seeing landscape? Can we reimagine Mars not as frontier or resource or colony, but having a presence and work outside of settler logics and frontier epistemologies? How can we represent another planet in an unfamiliar way? How can representing another planet in an unfamiliar way teach us to inhabit our own landscapes differently? So my painting prompt for all of you is anti-colonial Martian landscapes. And I've brought with me a number of books about Mars that has a lot of representations in this kind of colonial or settler idiom, but that we might use as a resource for rethinking and reimagining what a Martian landscape might be from different kinds of perspectives. That's it. Thanks.